Don't worry, I'll make a note. Okay. So we're going to go on line paper today. There we are. And today is lesson 2.4. And it's a word that I always misspell. So that's good because I'll have about 200 chances to misspell it. Well, not. Probably about 8 chances to misspell it today. Inheritance. Okay, let's put biology aside for a minute and just talk day-to-day life. What is an inheritance, or what is your inheritance? Yes, when Preston kills me, I think that was an uttering of threats, which is just the excuse I've been looking for, Mr. Jacques. But yes, an inheritance is something that gets passed on to you, usually by your parents or your grandparents, usually by a relative. Now, in our daily lives, we're usually talking about stuff, right? Money, or a house, or maybe a car. My friend Tara, when her grandpa passed away, she got this old Buick Century. It was like a 1981. The thing was a boat. It was enormous. And she was like one of the first of our friends to have a car. So we would drive around in this enormous old man mobile. But that was her inheritance from her grandfather. She inherited his car. My grandfather recently passed away, and I inherited part of his book collection, which I'm very excited about. Yes. Yes. That's ominous. Is that going to say I'm fired? I am checking my email right now, and I'm not seeing anything. That's interesting. Oh, got it. My personal email. Don't really know why that went to my personal email, but that's okay. All good. They'll make it work. Thanks. Okay. So, in the same way, I actually think inheriting my grandfather's book collection is a good analogy for what we're going to talk about today. Because, somebody's books tell you a lot about them. You kind of, by reading the books that somebody else has read, you can learn what they've learned and sort of know the same things they know and learn a lot about them. Especially my grandfather was a great margin writer. He had a real habit of writing in the margins and commenting on the book he'd read and highlighting things. So it really gives you, it's been neat. I'm reading a few of his books right now, and you kind of get an insight into the person. You see what they're thinking. So we're going to talk here about for the love.
Of what?
Okay, of me. As in, I would love it if my phone would stop making sound right now. So, every living organism has many different traits. Has many different traits. What is a trait? What's it mean to say something has traits? Like, do you want me to define that word, or are we comfortable with it? Let's define it. A trait is like a distinct characteristic. It's something about it that is different than other things, potentially. Characteristics. So some of your traits would include your height. I am kind of average-ish height. My dad is 5'4". He's a little guy. He's of low height. My uncle, on the other hand, is 6'2". That is getting into the range of being pretty tall. You know what I mean? Those are different traits. I have a relatively high voice, but some people have a low voice. Some people have voices much higher than mine. These are traits. Does that make sense? I have brown hair. Some of you also have brown hair, but some of you have lighter hair. Some of you have darker hair than I do. I have kind of vaguely wavy-ish hair, but mostly straight. Some of you have hair that's like super straight. I'm never sure if it's actually that straight or if you've spent like hours like making it go straight. And then some of you have much curlier hair than I do. These are all traits. Does that make sense? Now, I want to keep in mind, traits aren't just things you can see. My liver produces more iron than it's supposed to. It has since I was a teenager. So every month I donate blood. And that's a part of my regular routine to keep my blood iron levels from going too high. Most people have normal iron levels, which is nice. Some people have low iron levels. Do you know what you call that? Iron deficiency, there's a name for it. Don't worry about it, this isn't on the test, but anemia. Some people are anemic. They have low blood iron. Those are traits too. Traits don't have to be things you can see with your eye. All right, you can't look at me and say, that guy's got high blood iron. Sorry? I don't mind blood. I don't mind pain. I don't like needles because there's that intellectual thing where I know right now a piece of metal is inside my vein and it creeps me out. It's not a pain thing. It's not a blood thing. It's the very specific visual image of, do you know what I mean? Is anyone else kind of creeped out by that? Sorry. And I once was in Haiti giving blood, and I was like, okay, this is important. I give blood all the time here, so I'm pretty confident with it. So I'm there, and I'm like, okay, stay calm, don't embarrass yourself in front of the Haitians. And then they pulled out the biggest needle I've ever seen in my friggin' life. Like, you could drive a car through this thing. And I was like, ah! And there's this great picture of me and the Haitian lady said, children do this all the time. And I thought, oh, and I felt shame. Anyway, that's the end of my story. So every living organism has many different traits. They have different distinct characteristics. And for a long time, we have known that these traits get passed on from generation to generation. In general, if you know two people who are super tall and they end up having a kid together, what are you going to assume about that kid? That kid is likely going to be tall. Is it a guarantee? No, there's no guarantees, but likely. If two people who are really short end up having a kid together, your assumption is that kid is likely going to be short, right? It goes to hair color. If two people with really dark hair have a really light hair colored kid, people start making mailman jokes, right? Because our assumption is that the traits of an offspring will resemble the traits of the adult. By the way, don't make mailman jokes because it is very possible for you to have very different traits from what traits are visible in your parents. And we're going to talk about why that is. But secondly, don't pick on the poor mailman. It's not his fault. His kid has different colored hair. But for a long time, we've known that traits get passed on. I had a speech impediment growing up, a very kind of profound one. Now it's mostly under wraps. I mostly can manage it. But all of my kids had the same. All of my kids have had to go through speech therapy with the exact same mispronunciations I had, even though by the time I raised them, I was no longer making those same mispronunciations most of the time. So we know there must be something going on with my biology that got passed along. Does that make sense? So for a long time, we've known that traits get passed on from generation to generation. And you hear it all the time. People see a kid and they go, oh my goodness, you look just like your mom. Or you look just like your dad, right? Does anyone here look a lot like their parents? Yeah, a few of you. Because sometimes I love doing parent-teacher night. Because some parents you meet and you're like, all right. And then sometimes you see a parent coming from 80 miles away and you're like, oh, know who that is. You can just tell. Some people look a lot like their families and some people less so. And it can change over time. I feel like I never used to look kind of like my parents, and I feel like as I'm getting older, I look like my dad. If my dad, like, I don't know, ate one of his brothers or something, my dad's this skinny little thing, but like my face kind of looks like his now, and I never felt like it did before. So for a long time, we've known that these traits get passed on. Now, in the 1800s, a guy named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed one theory of how this might work. As it happens, we think it's mostly not the right one, but that's okay. We're going to start there. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed a theory of what he called blended inheritance. And the basic idea is pretty simple. The idea is that if we had a really tall lady here and short little guy there, and they have offspring, we're going to symbolize all that with a plus sign and an arrow, what is likely going to be the case with the offspring? And the idea is that, well, offspring usually will be a blend of their parents. So the expectation is then that you would expect the offspring to fall somewhere in the middle in terms of height. And we're using height just because it's a really good, easy visual thing to draw. Does that make sense? This is the basic idea. The idea is offspring traits are a blend of parent traits. Please be quiet. Okay, so here's the thing. This was put to the test in a few different ways, but there's a most famous example. Do not disturb. There we go. There's a most famous example of a guy who did some testing with this and proved that this actually can't be true. For the record, by the way, there is something to this. We're going to talk about it if time permits later in this unit. This isn't completely wrong, but it's not the whole picture. Yeah.
My dad's 6'3" and my mom's 5'1".
And how tall, may I ask how tall you are right now?
4'10".
4'10"?
Mom should be 5'3" though. But still shorter than tall.
Yeah, it can happen. We're going to talk about why. So there's a guy who comes along, and his name is Gregor Mendel. And we're going to give him a big old title because he's important. And so we're going to like all caps that, and we're even going to spell his name right if I can. And Mendel is the scientist, and he tested inheritance using pea plants. Yeah, and pea plants are a great thing to choose because if you, even in the winter, does anyone grow any kind of sprouts or anything like that in their house during the winter? Do you? Do you have like a little light or just keep them by a window? Nice, and as long as it's warm enough in there, they sprout up? Beautiful. We do too. I love it. I think it's a wonderful way. I think it helps with my like miserable winter depression to have something green growing in the house. But then you can put sprouts on food and it's delicious. So there's lots of things to like about it. The nice thing about a pea plant is they grow very quickly. All right. When we get to our plant unit, we're going to grow some plants, and you'll see they can grow quite speedily. So the nice thing about that is you can grow a pea plant, you can collect the seeds of the pea plant, and then you can plant those seeds and let them grow until they have peas, and then you can take them and plant them. And do you see how in a few weeks you can have children then grandchildren, then great-grandchildren of the original plant. Does that make sense? You can test generations in just a few weeks, whereas if we try to test generations of humans, how long are we looking at? Yeah, like 20 years to get a second generation, 40 years for a third, so on and so forth. You're talking a huge span of time. So pea plants are very convenient to test this on because you can go generation to generation to generation. I wasn't going to write that. Are you comfortable if I don't write that? We've talked about it. Okay. So here's what he did. He actually looked at a bunch of different traits, but we're going to look at one example. He crossed, and what does it mean to cross? He crossed two pure breeds. A tall plant and a short one. So plants, believe it or not, reproduce sexually. We don't always think of that because you don't think of plants being out there having sex, but they are all the time. And how do they do that?
I kind of don't want to think about that.
No, not roots. I guess that makes sense, but no, not roots. They don't use the roots. Do you guys not know? Yeah. Yeah! They use their flowers. Pistils, stamens. Have you guys seriously never learned this? What do they teach you in elementary school? So yeah, plants pollinate, and that's important. Listen, I have fruit trees in my backyard, and unless you have something there to pollinate them, they won't produce fruit, because fruit are the sexual product of plant reproduction. All right? A seed, which for a lot of trees comes in the form of fruit that you can then plant in the ground, is a sex cell. It's a gamete. It's ready to plant and form a new cell. And for that to happen, you have to take the pollen from one plant and put it onto the stamen of another plant and allow it to fertilize. And once that has happened, then it will bud and then it will form fruit. This is why plants always blossom before they grow fruit. If you have a cherry tree, you might get cherries in late July. But when do you get cherry blossoms? Way back in May. That's when pollination needs to happen. Same with apple blossoms, same with peach blossoms, right? So if you ever want to go for a beautiful drive, don't drive to peach season when the peaches are on the trees. That's boring looking. Go drive through Vineland when it's blossom season and they all look absolutely beautiful. Well, I hate to tell you this, but that's when the plants are having lots and lots and lots of plant sex. They're moving pollen from one plant to another. They're reproducing sexually. So, what is a pure breed? So when we say crossing, we mean sexual reproduction. And what do we mean when we say a pure breed? Does anyone here have a purebred dog?
Yeah.
What's a pure breed?
It's something that's like no other kind of thing.
Good. A pure breed means there's no traits hiding in there that we haven't seen yet. In other words, when we say a purebred tall plant, that means plants where if you plant a seed, it's tall again. And then if you breed those and plant it, tall again, tall again, tall again, tall again. Just a long line of nothing but tall plants. And we mix that with a long line of nothing but... Yeah, you bet. You don't have to ask me that. You can always just go. So listen, we have purebred tall plants. Plants that just, no matter how many times you breed them with other tall plants, they're just always tall. And then we have another line that are always short. And he bred those for many generations. So he was really sure he had purebred tall plants and purebred short plants. Does that make sense? And once they were stable, he crosses them with each other. And get ready for some beautiful art. Here is my tall pea plant, and it's in blossom, so it's got a nice flower up here. It's a very nice flower. And then here is the short one.
Can we draw them?
Yes, of course. You think I'm doing this for my health? Yeah. And Lamarckian inheritance tells us that what would we expect to see? Yeah, you would expect that you've got this tall plant and you've got this short one. You would expect the offspring to kind of be somewhere in between, maybe about like that. And we'll talk. So this is what he expected to see. But here's the thing. Is that what he saw? No. In fact, he discovered that no matter what, not most of the time, not kind of most of the time, not here or there, 100% of the time that he did this, 100% of the time he bred a purebred tall plant with a purebred short plant, he got a tall plant. No exceptions. %100 of the actual outcome. And he could do this over and over and over and over and over and over again. And no matter what he did, he always got a tall plant. Well, what in the world does that mean?
Some DNA more dominant.
Aha! Very good. So let's write a little sentence about this drawing, and I'll give you a minute to get that drawn. So we'll say a cross between pure tall and pure short. A cross between pure tall and pure short. Gives an F1 generation. We'll talk about what that means. Gives an F1 generation that is 100% tall. The F in this case stands for fecundity. It just means having offspring. So F1 just means the first generation of offspring. The first generation of offspring. And our common word for that is your first generation. If you one day choose to have children, or don't choose, but it still happens, regardless, if you have children, they will be, your first generation of offspring will be your sons and daughters, right? Does that make sense? When we talk about the F1 generation, we're talking about the sons and daughters of the original species involved. What would we call the grandchildren? The F2 generation. The great-grandchildren? The F3 generation. Very good. The original parents we call the P generation. That's pretty obvious. P for parent. Does that make sense? Okay. And I am so pleased that somebody said this, and I can't remember who, I think maybe it was Preston, but Preston made the exact same inference that Gregor Mendel made. What, by the way, is an inference? You should have learned the heck out of this in grade 9 science, but I think I taught you grade 9 science, and so we know how that goes. What does it mean to infer something?
You see something happen and you extrapolate based off of what you saw.
That's right. It is proposing a meaning to an observation you've made. He observed.
Mr. Orlando?
Yeah.
There are two types of people in this world.
Okay, no. Quiet. Focus. The last thing I need is help getting, I should say observation. So his observation was that a cross between pure tall and pure short parents gives an S1 generation that's 100% tall. And what does he infer? He infers exactly what Preston said, which is that, I think it was Preston. If I'm giving somebody's credit away, let me know. Tallness is a stronger trait than shortness. And so he basically gives this idea. He says, well, wait a minute. If we kind of call big T being tall, and then he comes up with this idea that we always use the letter of the strong trait. Tallness is the strong trait. And then to show the weak one, we don't use S for short, because then we wouldn't know we're talking about the same thing. So his system that he comes up with, which is actually a pretty good one, is if we say T is whether we're talking about how tall this thing is, If it's tall, we call it big T. We say that's tallness. And what would we call being short? Little t. Very good. That would be the case of being not tall, or specifically in this case, our word for not tall is short. And what he says is that tallness is a, what word is that? A dominant trait. And shortness is a, very good. You've heard that before. Very good. So the idea he has is that some traits are recessive. He knows for a fact that this plant has some information from this parent saying, hey, be tall. And it has some information from this parent saying, hey, be short. But which one actually happens? Tall. So he knows that this plant must have both pieces of information in there. They don't yet know about genes. He doesn't know about DNA yet. Does that make sense? If you know about DNA, this is kind of easy to figure out, but he doesn't know about DNA. But he knows there's some kind of passing on of information. And he knows that when those pollen come together with those stamen, that this one says, hey, be tall, this one says, hey, be short, and the plant goes with tall. So he concludes that tallness is a dominant trait, and shortness is recessive. Now, this plant may look like this plant, but there is a difference. This plant is purebred. All of its instructions say, be tall. But we actually know that this plant, even though it looks tall, do all of its instructions say be tall? No, it's got some instructions that say, hey, be tall, and some blueprints that say, hey, be short. It is just expressing the hey, be tall. So we're going to talk about that. Basically, the idea is this. We started with a pure tall. That is the worst looking plant I've ever seen, but that's okay. That's okay. Actually, it's not okay. I take it back. I can't live with it. We started with a pure tall and a pure short, just like that. Tall and short, right? Pure tall, pure short. And from there, we're going to do something that you would never do with people, but I think with plants we don't need to object. If this is the P generation, these are going to produce, what do we call the offspring of the P generation? The F1 generation. And let's say we get 2 plants out of that. We know both of the plants that come out of this crossing will be tall. Okay. Now let's say we bred them. Again, I don't encourage you to engage in breeding with anyone who's in the same F1 generation as you. In humans, that's a discouraged activity. But in plants, it's cool. We're good. So in this case, this is tall and this is tall. But the question is, are these pure tall? Well, what does Mendel see? What do you think he's going to see? What's the next generation look like? If we take these 2 tall plants that we know actually aren't pure, what does the next generation look like? And this is where Mendel stumbles on something really interesting. Because what he stumbles on is that most of the time, you actually get a tall plant again. In fact, if I had 4 offspring, how many are going to be tall? 3. And this works religiously. If you have a lot of pea plants and you do this test, 75%, and if you do a big number, 75%, not 71%, not 78%, but if you do thousands of plants, it will land right on 75% will be tall, and then the remaining one will be medium or short. What do you think? Short. Very good. And it's very predictable. So the F2 generation ends up being 75% tall and 25% short. So the question is, what the heck is going on here? We go from 50-50 to 100% tall to 75-25. Okay, we know tallness is dominant, but what is happening here? Yep.
So like, sorry.
No, you're great.
There are two, like if there's one parent, like this is like humans. If there's one parent that's purely like black and one parent that's purely white,
Yep.
then if they have an offspring, wouldn't the offspring be like look purely white or look purely black?
The answer to that is the genes involved in race. Keep in mind that like race isn't like you're the same species as that. These are just different traits, but the traits of race aren't like one trait or two traits. There are lots and lots and lots of traits. We tend to think the most obvious one is melanin, right? Like how dark someone's skin is. But the truth is, all race is that when people before now in 2020, it is easy to move from one place to another, right? And so now it is very easy to breed with people who have very different traits from you, right? Does that make sense? But thousands of years ago, it was very hard to move from place to place. And records show us that by and large, most people through human history were born in one place, lived in that place, and died in that place. Moving from one place to another was very uncommon because it was hard to do before we had technology. Does that make sense? So when we say people are of different race, all we really mean is that a long time ago, their ancestors were kind of stuck in one place, and they developed a bunch of traits together. And then the people over here who live together developed a bunch of different traits, but they just developed them differently because they're in different places. And some of those are pointed, which is we find that people who lived near the equator tend to have more melanin. They tend to have darker skin because the sun was more intense. And people who lived in more northern climates tend to have fairer skin, to the point where you look at people who live in like Siberia and other places like that, and they have incredibly white skin. The Nordic countries, we think of them as being like super white skinned because there isn't a lot of sun and they didn't need that same protection from the hot midday sun. Yeah, of course. But like, that's not one trait. It's not like those are like, oh, black gene and it's dominant or recessive. It's not like that at all. And that, by the way, is what people totally misunderstand. This is why when people have no idea about biology talk about race, they say dumb stuff because they're thinking of it as like, oh, there's a gene and that, but it's not. It's just black people like white people, like Asian people, like all the other categories. These categories are completely made up because the truth is we all have all the same genes. We have different alleles, and we have some alleles we call in common. And we have chosen just arbitrarily to say, well, when people have similar skin tones, that makes them one race. But that's ridiculous. I mean, why not by height? It is just as meaningful to say everybody who is tall is one race and everybody who is short is another race. And everyone whose average height is mixed race. That has just as much biological meaning. But if we said that, you'd be like, well, that's stupid. But why? It's the exact same thing. It's picking a random trait and saying people who are on one extreme belong to one race, people who are on the other extreme belong to another race, and people in the middle are mixed.
Because race is like a social construct.
Exactly. And that's exactly. There's no biological basis to race. And people go, well, oh, you're saying people don't have different skin tones? Of course they do. It's just that isn't a more meaningful biological trait than any other skin trait. It's just a really visible one. It's one that's easy to see. But I'd argue it's less visible than height. You can see from miles away while people are wearing parkas their relative heights. I think that's what we should base race on. I mean, it's completely arbitrary. Yeah.
My dad's a lot darker than me. He's brown though, and my mom's white.
Yeah.
So like, why is my skin so pale?
Well, you tend to get a blending, but there's no guarantees. You can also have two. You can absolutely have two light-skinned parents have very dark-skinned children. It doesn't happen often because dark skin tends to be a dominant trait, but it can happen. So you have my wife has delivered children who like are way darker than their parents. And again, you start getting mailman jokes, but there's no mailman joke. It's just the way genetics work. We're going to talk about it. So why? But you're on the right track. The answer is all sexual organisms are diploid, which we know. And I'm not even going to write it again. What does diploid mean? Very good. 2 copies of each gene. So here we go. So we're diploid, which means we have our paternal gene on the left from our dad and our maternal gene on the right from our mom. And maybe right here, right in that spot on this chromosome is the tallness gene. Now we're still talking about pea plants here, but that is the tallness gene, right? We have 2 copies of it. But for pea plants, height is controlled by 1 gene. Is controlled by 1 gene with 2 alleles. And remind me, what's an allele?
I was told to bring this back to you.
Thank you very much. Sorry? A different version of a gene. So, why? Who? What? No. Why? I don't know. What? Who? This is a geography computer. Do I look like a geography teacher? Yes. To moving it up, not to me looking like a geography teacher. I don't. Okay. So, alleles are different versions of a gene. In this case, we've already said the 2 versions, but I'm going to write it again. Up to you if you want to write it again. We have the gene big T, which stands for tall, and little t, which stands for short. And by convention, the one we make capitalized is the dominant gene. That's the one that's pushy. In other words, if a pea plant has a copy of a gene that says be tall, it will be tall. Doesn't matter if it has 2 copies or 1 copy. Any copy of the tall gene is enough for it to be like, oh, gonna be tall. That's the blueprint needed. Does that make sense? You just need 1 copy. You don't need 2. So what are the possible combinations? If I am diploid as a pea plant, what are the possible combinations of genes? Of alleles, I should say. So a pea plant is diploid. It's got 2 copies. And that means that its maternal gene is either going to be big T or its maternal gene is going to be little t. Either its mother gave it a tall gene or its mother gave it a short gene. What about its paternal gene? The one it gets from dad is either going to be big T or little t. So are those the only 2 combinations? No, of course, because what if mom gave it a big T, but dad gave it a little t? And what if mom gave it a little t, but dad gave it a big T? Okay, so the first one is the most obvious. In this case, the plant is obviously going to be tall. What about in this case? Because this one says be short, that one says be short. This is easy. Obviously, it's going to be short. What about here, where it has 1 of each? Well, don't forget that which one is? It's going to be tall, because tall is dominant. And what about this one? Also going to be tall. Doesn't matter which one comes from mom, which one comes from dad. What matters is that they are the same. By the way, I'm going to do I want to introduce this term now? No, I'm going to introduce it in 2 minutes. Settle down. Let's look at another example. Exempla gratia 2. It's of course Latin for the sake of example. Very good. Seed color. And I'm going to use a U when I spell color because I'm a good British Commonwealth citizen. There we go. Okay, seed color. Okay. When purebred yellow pea plants are crossed with pure green plants, and I should say we're talking about seeds here, 100% of their children, by the way, what do we call their children? The F1 generation, very good, are, anyone want to guess? Yellow. Sorry. Okay, when purebred yellow plants are crossed with purebred green seed plants, 100% of the F1 generation are yellow seed. So you tell me right now, here we said that big T was tall, it was dominant, small t was short, it was recessive. Tell me right here how we should name these. Sorry? Capital Y, and what does that code for? Codes for yellow. And then what symbol are we going to use for green seeds? Should I use a G? I should use a lowercase y. We always use the same letter. There's actually a few other conventions too we'll learn. So which of these do we say is which? How would we describe these two traits? We would say the yellow gene is... No, I will not!
Cafeteria menu is pickle soup for $2, chef salad for $3.75, and the main is chicken club wrap fries for $5. Thank you.
How would we describe this trait? We would say that it is dominant. And we would say that this one is recessive. Very good. Okay, what are the possible, and I'm going to introduce two words to you here. And I actually think they're pretty obvious words once you see them. Well, one of them is genotypes and the phenotype that goes with it. Okay, one of these words I think is pretty obvious. Which one of these words seems pretty clear what it means? I mean, surely not phenotype, because what the heck does that mean?
Possible.
Okay, fair enough. But genotype, that's actually pretty obvious. What's meant by a genotype?
Type of gene?
The type of genes you have. So what are the possible arrangements of genes you can have here? Come on, you've got big Y is dominant, that's yellow. Little y is recessive, that's green.
Big Y, big Y.
Okay, yeah, okay, sorry. I asked and I wasn't ready. You could be big Y, big Y. What would that look like? Phenotype means the physical trait. Sorry? Not tall, because we're not talking about that anymore. It would be? It would be yellow. Very good. Okay, what is the next possible genotype? Which, by the way, means what alleles an organism has. What alleles an organism has. And, sorry, I cut you off, Shante. What is it? Both lowercase? Very good. And if it's both lowercase y's, what is that plant going to look like? Very good. Can somebody else give me another possible genotype? Very good. And what will that look like? Very good. And finally? Very good. And that would also look? Very good. Do I have till 50 or 55? So I'll save the 3 words till tomorrow. Okay. So this is the way it works. So I want to come back to your race mention, because the problem with human traits is our traits tend to be handled not just by one gene, but by a few. Does that make sense? Which means it's hard just to play this game. But there's actually one that isn't like race, that isn't like hair color, isn't these, but that actually is controlled by just one gene. And you know what it is? It's a fun one. Everyone, give me a thumbs up. Go hitchhiking. All right? And let's look around you. And you'll see a difference. Everyone do it and like put it all the way. What do you see? Blaine, are you pushing as hard as you can? Because you'll see that some of us have this curve back that is distinct. It really bends, so it's at like 45 degrees. And some people, when they go as hard as they can, it still looks like it's pretty much mostly straight up. Oh, Tashante, you're a good example. Are you pushing as hard as you can? Okay, come stand up here. Yeah, look at the difference. Do you see mine and then see Tashante's? Mine is literally at like a 45-degree angle, and yours is close to like, what, 10 degrees? This is called a hitchhiker's thumb. You do not have one. I do have one. See it? Big angle on there. Well, this is actually a gene that's controlled by one single locus, one single gene. There's a hitchhiker's thumb allele and a relatively straight thumb allele that controls the shape of your thumb joint. And depending on which copy you have one trait or the other. All right, we'll talk about that tomorrow. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. Elbowed you. Have a wonderful day. Be kind to one another. Don't do anything Haley wouldn't do. And we'll talk about this. You're going to have another quiz, not tomorrow, but on... Is tomorrow Thursday? Yeah. On Friday, we're going to have another quiz.
Why?
Because I want to. I'm not mean. That's false. I don't accept that. Okay, I got to go pick up my tax documents. If you're studying for tax time, I highly recommend teach you how to file your taxes. Important skill for life.
No! You thought he was gonna hand deliver them to you? No. I'm the one who just hand delivered them. So yeah, mine's like that too. Except all my papers are crumbled in the bottom of my bag. And I haven't really gotten any new ones since then. I want to see tattoos.
Pizza is coming. It's going to be a little late, but it's going to be there. And we can keep people for 5 extra minutes or whatever if need be. But the pizza place was busy-ish. I'm going to put a page in for my people. Yep. And I printed off some tuition forms because I thought that's one that probably is apropos. It's a nice simple one. And if we make good time, would you mind paging people down for a tax seminar in room 80? Just say anyone who's interested. Could you mention even if they didn't come yesterday? Nope.
Anyone who's interested in the tax seminar, please go to room 80. Again, anyone interested in tax seminar, room 80. Thank you.
I feel like that didn't sell itself well. No, that doesn't scream
it has
like.
to be more like exciting, like anyone interested, and
Why wouldn't
like
you go
you gotta
down
be happy.
I hate. I hate going on the PA. Hey, so you know I'm teaching budgeting this. I'm using Mint.
Mint? Is that, I heard all those ads about it, yeah.
Yeah, so I use Mint,
here if you're
and
grabbing
Mint
one.
can eventually auto-download all your transactions and categorize them, which is amazing. I'm not doing that with them, but it's got a great budget interface where you go there and you can design.
Is it
it's
a
all
free to use app for
free
kids?
to use, and I'm having them sign up with their DSBN account, and I'm having them all sign up with the same password.
Is it on our allowed list?
I don't care. I'm not looking.
You're the IT guy,
But I'm
so
having
yeah.
them use all the same password, and that way I'm going to mark it by actually just logging in as them, seeing what they've done. But it's really nice because just as simply as saying every month, this is like our budget for income, and then like as you start adding line items, like it's just great because on the side it shows like by category of this is how much you have left. So I'll let you know how it goes, but I think I'm going to like it.
Question for the What's My Mark tab.
Yep.
Is it just the banking or just the Markbook app?
Or
From the
no.
students'
Orlando Mark Viewer.
Orlando Mark View, okay. I didn't know which
Orlando
one it
Mark
was, so I
Viewer.
just set up the tab.
And check, I'll be curious, I'm having an issue with it right now where they have to click these show archived classes or inactive classes, even though they're I gotta figure out what I'm doing wrong there.
Okay. And
But
I also noted
throw it in there.
I cannot change the category of an assignment once I've set it.
Okay,
doesn't seem to stick.
yeah, I don't think I ever actually got around to doing that, so we should do that.
And I changed it so I can impersonate people, which was an easy, I just added an or.
Nice, perfect.
Yeah, half of them did not take